La Blue Luncheonette. When Louise stepped out of her home, she was caught by a typical blustery Nova Scotian wind and buttoned her coat down to the last button. There was a glimmer of sun and a blue sky. She stepped onto the path to walk down to her job at the dockyard and saw the first crocus poke its cheeky lavender head out of the snow. She smiled at it. It was going to be a lovely day. Yesterday, she'd seen a handsome young man, a new worker at the Blue Luncheonette, standing outside smoking a cigarette. They had locked eyes for a brief moment, and Louise had looked away. Today her step was light as she hurried down to work. It wasn't just the crocus that made her hurry. He was there, silhouetted against the early morning light, leaning against the doorpost with the restaurant sign above his head. She wanted to see him again, but she didn't want him to catch her doing so. She thought she'd walk quickly past him, check him out through the corner of her eyes, and see if he was really as handsome as she recalled. Bonjour, he said, stepping in front of her, bowing low and doffing his cap. French, Louise thought and blushed. Good morning, she replied. I don't speak French. Oui, I know, he fumbled with the words. Vous sont jolis, he said, his hazel brown eyes crinkled at the corner, and his light brown hair fluttered in the wind. He straightened up, replacing the cap on his head. She knew enough school French to know he thought she was pretty. She couldn't contain her amused delight and laughed. It was a clear, bell laugh, accompanied by a bright, open smile that lit up her face and eyes. That laugh and that smile were like bright sunshine to Jacque. They were the first expressions of warmth and frank friendship that had greeted him in this cold grey outpost of the place they called Halifax. He'd practiced that ha till his breath steamed in the cold air. His natural tendency to say Halifax had been tamed. This place was to be his new home until the war was over. He had wanted no part in that, and certainly didn't want to be conscripted into a battle against an enemy he didn't know. He promised his parents that he'd return or send for them across the ocean when the time was right. Then he took that arduous winter journey across the choppy Atlantic, paying his way by working as a cook in the ship's galley. He'd arrived barely 2 months ago at the pier in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He had never experienced such bitter cold as he had on the journey across. Then he'd arrived in the middle of February to a city covered in ice and snow. Thanks to his knowledge of cooking and his experience on the ship, he had found work at the Blue Luncheonette, along with board and lodgings in the attic. Now here was this beautiful vision laughing and smiling at him, spreading her wholehearted affection to him. A stranger invited him with that beautiful smile to be part of it all. He continued. Je m'appelle Jacque, he said, holding out his hand. Louise shook his hand, smiled and nodded. She could feel a deep, warm blush as it crept up from her neck, colored her cheeks, and suffused her face. I have to rush to work, she said abruptly, adding work again as she released his hand and hurried on without looking back. What had happened? She was behaving like a giddy schoolgirl. The electricity that had passed between them was so intense it had startled her. Votre nom, s'il vous plaît, he called after her. Please, he thought, I can't have this vision of beauty disappear from my existence like dew in the morning sun. I must see her again. I must know her name. Louise stopped, turned around and called out, I'll tell you tomorrow. Ah, he somehow understood that. Tomorrow was always a time of hope. She would come this way again. He watched her as she walked down the street. Louise was a tall, well-built girl with dark, wavy brown hair that tumbled down to the middle of her back and was held in place against the flirtatious breeze with a barrette and a simple beret. Her tan swing-back coat was both practical and smart. It swung saucily with each stride, accentuating her waist and hips. She was acutely aware of his eyes on her. Jacque was transfixed. Très belle, he said to himself. Those eyes, mon Dieu, they were as dark as just roasted coffee beans. Just thinking of her smile made him smile again. It was sunshine and warmth. It was love and hope. It was the scent of summer in a field and warm, fresh bread. It would take almost too long for tomorrow. But she had said, she had promised tomorrow. He could live until then. The next morning, there was a row of crocuses all winking at Louise. She'd added a dainty brooch to the lapel of her coat and a touch of lavender perfume to her wrists. I had barely said hello to him, she admonished herself, but there was no denying her heart was beating faster as she walked to work. He was there, leaning against the doorpost of the blue luncheonette, a casual stance that belied his own thundering heart. Would she come, the beautiful lady with a smile that would send him to paradise? He heard her footsteps. He had been dreaming of those footsteps all night long. They came to him and left us suddenly, a dream, a nightmare, a dream. She was there, despite the overcast skies, and all at once the world was beautiful. The birds were singing of the promise of spring. The leaves were pushing their way through the branches. He could smell the earth as it nudged winter away. She was there. He stepped into her path. Today he would not let her go until he had her name. It would be something to whisper in his lonely bed in the attic. It would be a word to caress his mind and his fevered forehead. Her name. Good morning, he said deliberately. He'd been practicing it in his head for a few minutes. Good morning, she beamed at him. You learn quickly. He grinned, his eyes lighting up. I practice, he confessed, but please, your name. It's important, she teased him, her eyes twinkling. Oui, très important for me, he smiled, looking straight into her eyes. Louise, she said, lowering her eyes, not able to hold the frank look of admiration in his. Louise, he exclaimed. Ah, c'est français. You are not French? No, Canadian, Louise replied. He was confused. How, Louise? Calm down, she laughed, that laugh that sent him to heaven and back in a second. My grandparents are from Italy. Ah, he flung his hands up and shrugged in Gallic comprehension. Louise, this time it was a hoarse whisper. He held out his hand, and she held out her hand with the glove removed. He raised it to his lips. Louise, he said, inhaling the perfume of her, drawing her into his being, his life. Louise, it was the most beautiful name in the world. It was the name for him. He could take that name and this girl and hold her in his arms till eternity. Their eyes met. Jacque, she said, his name a burr of honey on her lips. Jacque. They could say no more. Their names hung in the air, and slow as the mist of their breaths they met, came together, and became one. 42 years they were married. Their home was a place of laughter and stories, of Italian dishes and French flair, a truly Canadian home, where the first word of the day was always love, and the last word, je t'aime.